It is the week of October 19th, 2015, and this is the GrowingPoint Agronomy Podcast.
This is the podcast that talks everything agronomy and only agronomy, tackling current agronomy topics, management strategies, and answering questions submitted from our listeners.
On this week's episode, we are going to discuss harvest progress, early corn results, fall soil sampling, as well as answering questions submitted by our listeners.
And now your hosts, DuPont Pioneer field agronomists Josh Shofner and Brian Buck.
Josh, we've continued to have great fall weather outside of some wind last Monday. How's harvest coming along?
Yeah, pretty good. That wind was actually a little bit scary. I was really happy to see we didn't get much rain with that. Overall, I think the corn stood up pretty good. I did see a little bit of down corn here and there, especially fields that were opened up around the headlands. Had a little bit of stuff go down, but overall, I think we dodged a bullet with that wind. I was expecting that we could have had a little bit more problems with that. But overall, harvest continues to go well. We've talked about the weather, I think, every episode so far this fall, and the weather continues to be favorable, and really the outlook through the month of October looks good. I anticipate harvest to continue to progress at a pretty rapid pace, and by November, kind of just come down the home stretch by then.
Yeah, it's been a nice change of pace. By the time we finished up last fall, we were trying to combine corn in sub-freezing temperatures. We were pulling some frost and some little bit of snow here and there through the combine. It was making yield monitors not work great. So this is a nice change of pace. It's a lot easier to dry corn in this weather too. So it's really been a great fall compared to what we maybe had the last year.
Yeah, I don't really no complaints at all. The moistures on the corn has been really good and continue to drop down a lot of moistures now into the teens, and some growers are taking stuff out of the field, 17-18% already, and that's a good thing. Test weights are coming up. We've been talking about that. They've seen more 56s and pluses out there coming out of the field as it dries down, and really yield results, although a lot of variability, yields continue to come out really good overall. Looking at just plot averages and some field averages, seeing some big bushels out there.
Yeah, we just saw a plot that came out the other day in that 250 range, plus or minus 10 on either side, but there is some huge bushels out there. There are some fields still that, for whatever reason are off. We'll talk about that here in a little bit, some of the things that cause that. But when you look at yields, beans were excellent, and now corn yields in general are there's some pretty big bushels out there in a lot of fields.
Yeah, Ryan, looking at our replicated PKP trials, our GrowingPoint agronomy trials that we put out across southeast and southern Minnesota, I haven't dug into it all, and we're only about 25% of the way through those trials, but looking at last year's average to this year's average, it's in the ballpark of a plus 20, plus 25, which is pretty amazing.
Kind of puts us back into that level we saw in 2012. The last 2 years, we were probably that 20, 30 bushel off where we were in 12, and I think on average we're probably going to float back up towards that range.
Yeah. Anything else you're seeing harvest-wise, or things that we need to be watching out? Or I think from my standpoint, I guess just a standpoint of I just encourage growers to stay after it, and we got good weather, and last year October wasn't a bad month, but November went to deep freeze like January and I think the big thing is just stay after it and get this crop out. Stock quality is still not the best across everything from what I'm seeing. We saw it. I think we dodged a bullet with the wind. I think the big thing that I'm seeing is just keep pushing with harvest as hard as you can.
Yeah, got to keep moving, keep the combine rolling. Corn is dry enough, and where it's not, it's great weather to dry corn in. The one call out I would have would be around stock quality. There are some fields that had those crown rots, stock rots that we talked about in an earlier episode. And some of those, if we have another wind like we had last Monday, they could go down as it progresses. So, get out, do the push test if you have a chance, but just keep the combine rolling and go get those farms that maybe need to come out first.
Yeah, can't stress the harvest plan enough. Still got to have a good harvest plan. And really the harvest plan this year needs to be focused more on stalks than moisture. I think a lot of years we take the drier corn first. This year I think you take a look at the stalks and take the ones that are failing the push test the most and get those out as soon as you can. So Brian, we got a unique topic of the week, one that is extremely important. Looking at fall soil sampling with the crop coming out, it's a great fall for soil sampling. Anytime you get the crop rolling, a lot of it coming out in October, it gives you a chance to have your people get out there, get the soil sampling done. The other nice thing of a year like this is, I think you might be able to actually make some applications off the soil test this fall, because I think you're going to be able to turn them around quick enough to maybe still have time to do some stuff. So what are some things, around soil sampling we want to be thinking about right now, Brian?
First things first, a lot of guys, you get the questions a lot, when should I start sampling? Is there, can you do it as soon as you get the crop out? Do you have to wait a little bit? But really, it's more about timing within the year. So if you're a fall soil sampler, it's good to continue to be a fall soil sampler. And it's any time from here on out is good. It's just guys can't really sample once the ground freezes. So you got to get out and get after it if you have the chance. But when you get the beans are off in most situations, those farms can be sampled. The corn stalks can also be sampled as the corn comes off.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing, let's just start out with talking about how often should I soil sample. And again, there's maybe not a exact right or wrong answer with this. I think you and I are going to agree, a set of soil samples is probably good for around 3 crops. So, for example, if you sampled this fall, the 2016, 17, 18 crop would be good on that set, and then resample again. So I'm kind of a sample, is good for 3 crops. So looking back, if you sampled in, 2012 or so, it's time for another round of samples.
Yeah, so looking at it, and part of that's a little bit rotation dependent. So you think about it, beans have been off for a little while, so that gives an opportunity to get out there and sample early. So some guys will be a corn bean rotation, and they always want to sample their soybean ground. Adds a little consistency, but it also, you talked about having time to get that application out there. They're able to get out, sample the soybean ground, and make the application. But a lot of it is that 2 to 4 year range is pretty common right now. It's not something you need to do every year, but it is something you need to do, every 2 to 4 years.
Yeah, it's always nice as a former soil sampler. I always loved sampling soybean ground. Corn ground, I never really cared for that much between flat tires and the 4-wheeler and everything else. It's never the most fun thing to be out there, but it is always a nice, depending on your rotation, it is, in my opinion, a nice thing to try to catch those on the fall that it's soybeans, because the sampling's much quicker and it just goes a lot easier from a standpoint of who's doing your sampling.
Yeah, and one other thing to add there, you look at timing. It's something that needs to be done before fall tillage would start also. To look at consistency of samples, we really want a 6-inch sample depth, and it's really hard to keep a good 6-inch sample and a consistent sample if it's already been worked, whatever that may be, if it's chisel plowed or ripped or whatever it could be. So you got to get those samples before the tillage runs too.
Yeah, and really when you get into the do's and don'ts, we talked about, number 1, be consistent when you sample. If you've been sampling the fall, stay in the fall. Number 2, you just cannot sample tilled ground. If you're sampling tilled ground, in my opinion, those are just throwaway samples. Maybe if you're picking up a new farm or something different, you just need a rough gauge or some pH or something, you can get away with it. But if it's on ground you've been farming, you do not sample work ground. You just can't get a uniform thing. Anything else, before we get into the details of some methods and things to go about, or just the simple do's and don'ts of soil sampling?
Yeah, I think you hit on them there. The consistency is really important. So if you're a fall sampler, always fall sample, getting before the tillage. And the other thing is just always keep in the back of your head, the sample results are only as good as the sample taken. So if you're just taking a really small area out in the field and you're not getting the distribution you should, it's not going to be a very great sample to come back and make recs off of. So it's really about consistency, and high quality samples make high quality recs that get good bushels later.
Yep. 6 to 7 inch cores when you're doing the fall, especially if you're sampling for pH, P, and K. That's where you want to be. So those are some of the really basic things that got to take place to get a good sample. So now let's roll into a few things around, there's a lot of different ways we can soil sample. You hear things of composite soil samples. We talk about maybe some zoning, and then all the way down to getting into grid samples. So let's just kind of go through each one by one. Brian, if you want to roll into, let's talk about composite sampling. Still, historically the most common, still a lot of composite sampling done. Why don't you give us a few takes of where we'd use composite sampling? Let's look at the pros of it, the cons of it, and discuss where it's got a good fit.
All right, so composite sampling, when you look at composite sampling, historically it's taking and breaking a field into 5-acre squares roughly, and then you take an M pattern sample, or W, depending if you're from Minnesota or Wisconsin, but you take the M pattern and you run across that through that 5-acre block, mix all those cores together, around 12 to 15 cores, 15 is better, and then you put the sample in the bag. So that's taking, and it's just a rough sample, then you move to your next spot, but it's not GPS located. So when you're looking at it, when it's all said and done, you have the samples that are roughly pulled from these 5-acre boxes, all mixed kind of an averaged out to give you an average over your whole field. So places this is probably most applicable is when you get into areas with smaller fields. You're not going to go and grid sample a 7-acre field or a 12-acre field or probably even a 15, 20-acre field. So that's probably the most applicable, or the main place it's used. And historically, we didn't have a lot of the GPS capabilities and things we do now. So it was the pretty much used for everything until the last 10 years here when we've had a lot more, or 15 years when we've had a lot more technology. But that's probably where I key up on the most.
Yeah, I think composite sampling, contour strips, I think of number one is probably where you utilize that the most. And again, there's fields if you just need to get a rough idea of what's going on, because composite sampling is good. The biggest thing about composite sampling when it comes to making a fertility suggestion or an application, probably just going to be a flat per field rate. You're not going to look at trying to find those low areas. Even though in a 100-acre field you may have 20 samples, you're still going to be looking at, we're still probably not going to be able to do anything other than just a blanket rate, try to find the best thing we can do, and try to fix that up. And
one other thing I think worth mentioning there to really differentiate out part of the reason, guys, is cost. I mean, you look at it, that sample's probably, you're about $2 an acre probably compared to 8 to 10 when you get into some of the more dense grid or grid sampling.
Yeah.
So,
and really, there places that I'm comfortable with it. If you have a really good base fertility and you got a good history of it, it's got a good fit. If you don't have that, then I think we need to start looking at some of the other ones we're going to talk about here down the stretch. And really, rolling into zone sampling. This is kind of a hybrid of composite to grid sampling combined. You're looking at zone sampling. We talked about this before the show a little bit, some areas we may use it. If you got some farms that got some really different soil types that are kind of blocked off, or half a farm is much different than the other half, you may do some zone sampling, whether it be 20, 10 acre zones, whatever you got to do, where you may actually split a farm and say, okay, this zone we're going to spread different, maybe not off a GPS, but just a flat rate, flag it. This zone's going to get different. What are some other things around zone sampling, Brian? I personally haven't done a lot of zone sampling. I've done some, and sometimes you can even call contour strip zone sampling, even though it's kind of one farm but broke up into fields. You're zone sampling. Where are some areas you use zone sampling?
Yeah, I think when you look at it, when you're using zone sampling, it really revolves around variability of the farms. So as you move east in a lot of the area we cover in southeast Minnesota, there's probably not as much zone sampling just because we have pretty consistent soil types. Your silt loams, they'll run on the bottoms and over the hills for the most part. As you move probably maybe a little more west in Minnesota or in other parts of the nation, you run into quite a bit different soil types. You might have a farm where it's peat or muck bottoms, and then move up to a sandy loam and kind of have a sand knoll top on a hill. So really what you're doing is taking that muck or peat soil, treating it different than the sandy loam, and just sampling them separate to make sure you're making the best rec on that part of the farm. So a little bit different than grid sampling. It's really focusing on the zone and really that soil type or variability within a field. Yeah,
and I think if you're working with someone on soil sampling that knows a lot about your farms and really walks your fields, I think zone sampling can be a really successful way to do it. Probably not, in my opinion, the best method if you're walking into something blind or maybe not knowing what you're getting into. I think you could maybe get yourself in trouble with some zone sampling. And obviously, it takes a little extra work. It's not something that it ain't going to be a load in a card and a monitor and spread it. You're going to have to be, pretty detailed of having stuff flagged out, having zones right, and maybe just a little bit more challenging for the person that's going to be doing the applying with different mixes and where do I make the change and things like that, and even estimating acres of where those zones are and how you're going to shake that out. But so rolling out of zone sampling, it's got to fit for some areas, but really grid sampling is something that's taken off quite a bit here the last decade, and really probably the premier way to soil sample. In my opinion, if you really don't know what you're getting into, or you got a farm with some variability, really not a better way to approach it than grid sampling.
I would agree, Josh. When you look at grid sampling in general, it's really came on because of some of the technology we have available today. So we talked about composite sampling, where it's roughly 5 acres. We take some cores from, and then when we're done with that field and all those different cores, you pretty much get an average of what the field is, and that's what you're making your applications. Grid sampling, on the other hand, you're at about 2.5 acres per sample, and it's GPS reference to every sample. So when you come back, you have the opportunity, if you have variable rate technology or if you have primarily variable rate technology, you can come back and spread based on those individual 2.5 acre zones. So you might have a K level in one part of the field that's 180 and 100 parts per million in another part of the field, and you're able to spread quite a bit more in that 100 parts per million compared to the 180. Or in pH is probably the best example, I would think, where you can have, in a composite situation, you could have all your samples come back at 6.5 or 6.7 and for an average, and you'll be really happy, when really that field has a range from 5.8 all the way up to 7.2, and some of those higher pHs shouldn't be getting any lime, and the lower ones should be getting quite a bit more. So pH is one of those main things, and I think that's why grid sampling's been so strong, is lime applications.
Yeah, in my opinion, you can justify the cost of it just for lime application, especially in the eastern part of Minnesota where the soils are more naturally low in pH, more acidic, where we technically have to do some frequent liming to keep the pH where we need it to be. The other thing is, let's just talk about the cost of this. We're probably talking $10 to $15 per acre versus maybe $5 to $10 per acre for some of the other methods of sampling, just to get a rough range of what the cost is here. But if you look at, there's times that I look at lime. You said it best. Let's just say you did a composite sample, comes back to 6.2. Maybe you're applying a couple ton of lime to get up to 6.8 or something like that. If you look at a composite field versus a grid sample, you'll see, lime applications ranging from a lot of the fields part of the field getting 0 because the pH is above the critical level you're targeting for. Then there's some getting 3-4 ton because it's 5.5, and you blend that together, you're still spreading maybe the same amount of lime or less lime, but you're getting it where it needs to be. So if you look at the value that you're getting out of the application, it's a no-brainer when it comes to lime. And variable rate liming technology is out there, and it works extremely well. Same thing with P&K. Brian, in southeast Minnesota, it's so common to look at grid sample results and see parts of the field that are under 75 part per million and parts of the field that are over 150. And that is just situations where you got to try to get that corrected. And sometimes, maybe the higher fertility is good spots, but more commonly, the low spots are some of the best areas of the field, highest yield potential, because that's just where your big yields are and you're pulling those levels down. And you want to address that because you want the good parts of the field to continue yielding.
Yeah, and when you look at that, you talked about how you might have just areas of the field where it is a lot higher, a lot lower. You look at 20, 30 years ago, there was a lot of livestock farms in the area. So you might have a farm that's 140 or 160 acres that's one field now, but back then it might have been quite a few fields. And it probably had a lot of manure applications close to the barn in the winter. So you have this area with super high fertility levels and this area with a lot lower fertility levels. And it just gives you an opportunity to start balancing that out instead of making the broad spectrum, application. So the other key thing with lime, when you look at lime and you talked about how it generally will pay for itself, the sampling cost just in lime applications, pH you can make too high. Potassium and phosphorus, you can get too high environmentally where that's not good. But pH you can get too high where it's really going to start hurting yield. So that's one of the key pieces there too. If you have a field with a big variability in pH and you go out and spread 2 ton of lime across everything, you might be decreasing yield in some spots of the field instead of just leveling yields out across the whole farm.
Yeah, absolutely. The scenario we said where you got pHs from 5.5 to 6.8, and maybe on average it's calling for 3 ton, you're going to drive that 6, 8, 7 areas, you're going to drive those up to 7.5, and now you've created a situation where that's an undesirable pH from a standpoint of nutrient uptake, and that's something that you just can't overlook and you got to be thinking about.
Josh, so we've talked quite a bit about, grid sampling being good, especially in these big farms with a lot of variability, maybe from historic applications. But we've kind of made it sound like if you have contour strips or a lot of smaller fields that maybe grid sampling is not right for you. Is there some scenarios where it could be?
I actually think there's great opportunities in contour strips or farms that you maybe got an 80, but it's chopped up into, 24 contour strips. Not uncommon in western Wisconsin and extreme eastern Minnesota. And actually, you shouldn't look at it that way. When we're talking about pH and soil level P, phosphorus, soil level K, potassium, we're really looking at, in most cases, we're fertilizing or adding lime to get to a target level. And really what I like to do in those situations is actually just grid sample, say that 80 with all those contour strips, grid sample it as it's one field. Because when it comes to lime, phosphorus applications, and potassium applications, you can just straight line that stuff, apply it, and then you can pick up on more variability, more data points and things like that. I actually prefer grid sampling those, and then on a fall that, maybe your contour strips with some alfalfa, some corn and beans, once that crop's all out, just straight line apply that stuff, and you can really see some nice benefits from looking at it in a situation like that.
Yeah, and another big gain you get there when you start looking at all those contour strips is you get so much overlap when you start spreading them all individually. pH, you can start causing some problems if you have a ton of lime overlap in the center of the strip. But you look at overall cost, it can save quite a bit of money from having an even application out there instead of all these overlaps and doubles where they really don't need to be.
Yeah, and most fertilizer applications, they don't have big shutoffs. It's maybe half the machine at best. And, if you got a 90-foot strip with 60-foot applications or maybe a width that don't really match up, there's a lot of excess and overlap and things like that where grid sampling can eliminate that, at least on the lime the P and the K, and you can save a lot of money from that standpoint.
And really, it could be one of the biggest opportunities when you look at some of those farms. The only challenge is you have to wait till all the crops off. So you got to wait for the beans to get off and the corn to get off, or if you have alfalfa, you just got to wait for the corn to get off. So one of those things to keep in mind if you're looking at it, but it is a good opportunity.
Absolutely, good opportunity. And Brian, we talked about a lot of places where grid sampling does fit. You ever run into scenarios where maybe grid sampling isn't the best fit?
So some scenarios that maybe it wouldn't be the best fit, if you have a farm that's pretty well evened out in pH and you grid sampled it 2 to 3 years ago, and you've got really good K levels, probably 200 plus phos levels, you'll see that especially east with the old manure applications, 30, 40 plus. You know that you have really good fertility out there, and if you've been making really good removal applications to keep those levels up, it might be a situation where some composite sampling could play again just to make sure you're maintaining where that's at, and then maybe the time after that you could come back and grid sample again. So it's not something that has to be done. When you hit a certain level of management or you have good soil levels and everything, you can get by composite sampling again just to make sure you're maintaining them up and your removal rates are high enough.
Yeah, and that's where I think you can maybe go, like you said, maybe skip, go 3 years, do a composite, then come back to grid sampling in situations like that. But I'm the same way. When I know the fertility is extremely good or even high, it comes to a point where, we can grid sample it, but all we're going to do is do a maintenance program anyway, and why spend the extra $5-7 an acre if all I'm going to do is a maintenance program? Either way. Well, with that, Brian, that was a good discussion of our topic of the week. How about we take a look at our question of the week now, and that is coming from Chris in Grand Meadow. How come my final yields are not matching my pre-harvest kernel count yield estimates? That's a loaded question, Brian.
That is a good question. So we've seen that quite a bit this year where, guys will go out and kernel count certain hybrids and say, well, it's only kernel counting at 190 bushel yield, and the one next to it's at 230. First things first, the kernel size can range from 70,000 kernels per bushel up to about 110,000. So you look at that, that's a pretty big percentage swing. Some hybrids naturally have bigger kernels. So you might have a hybrid that puts 12 to 14 around consistently. So your kernel count's not going to be very high, but it has a big, deep kernel. And just because of kernel size, it'll still yield. Another thing that can happen there is kernel depth. If you crack ears when you're looking at it, sometimes you have a little bit more popcorn kernels, and sometimes you have those really deep kernels, which is where a lot of big yield comes from too. So, that's another factor to look at. And, one of the last things maybe is just test weight. You can have, a 3-pound swing in test weight between two hybrids, which can also correlate back to another 6-7 bushel late fall. So looking at kind of those three main areas, you can have pretty big swings just in that kernel size. It's all about kernel size, as a mix in with as kernel count. So kernel count alone gives you a rough idea, but without kind of a rough idea with kernel size, it's a little bit inaccurate sometimes.
Yeah, there's a lot of variabilities there, especially to sum it up, really, kernel size and test weight are probably the biggest two factors that can throw you a bit of a curveball there. And something we see here, yield estimates are great, but you really never know for sure until the combine rolls and you weigh that stuff up and see how it comes out. So, question of the week, guys, if you want to get one of your questions of the week on the air and discussed, you can submit questions via Twitter. I am Josh Shofner at Josh Shofner.
I'm Brian Buck at FarmerBuck1.
Brian, that's a wrap for this week's podcast. This show is recorded from the Agronomy Bunker Studio in Zumbrota, Minnesota. It is produced by Brian Buck and Josh Shofner. This is a weekly podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week.